In part, it is interesting and notable because of the line of democracy that we hear so often in private conversations. Some Democrats told me, well, how can we be constantly talking about the threat that Donald Trump poses to our democracy when we are willingly standing behind a candidate that we don't think can do an effective job in running a campaign, let alone a country for another 4 years? So Democrats are grappling with a lot right now. There is no playbook for how this goes. I was talking to some leadership sources today. You heard Speaker Emerita Pelosi come out very forcefully, publicly, on our own shows this week, questioning and leaving the door open perhaps about whether Biden really did make his decision to stay in this race, as we repeatedly have heard, including from Monica Alba and her great reporting, that he has. Well, maybe he hasn't. Maybe there's a down the road situation where he changes his mind. I asked other Democrats in leadership, other sources, whether they're going to follow through, whether they're going to follow suit with what Pelosi had said. And they're in a precarious situation because they have to wait to see what their caucus says, what their membership decides. And these are also people like Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate, who are on the phones with donors day in and day out, hour by hour, and they are expressing concerns to these individuals. And again, it is not just about the White House. It is about the Senate and the House as well. And so these lawmakers are seeing a 5-alarm fire in November when most of them, a lot of them, I should say, are up for re-election, whether they can win having someone like President Biden at the top of their ticket. Sure, some of them will say, listen, we run independent of the president. But at the bottom line here is, of course, the person at the top of the ticket matters a lot. And these Democrats are looking for this weekend another goal marker, a goalpost perhaps, until they open the floodgates and make their decisions known, whether Biden stays in or Biden stays out.
Julie, thank you for that. I want to go back to Monica Alba. Julie just mentioned the fundraising, right, Monica? I know we have reporting on our end about some of the issues facing the Biden-Harris re-elect team and what's happening with fundraising. What can you tell our viewers tonight?
Yeah, I have to tell you, Tom, when it comes to the big dollar donors, these are the people who are sometimes referred to as the bundlers, who are responsible for a whole network of fundraisers. I am told by a source familiar with this effort that the money has absolutely shut off since the debate. Now, the Biden campaign argues and insists that there has been strong grassroots fundraising. So when you're talking about maybe people who are supporters of the president but hadn't chipped in those $5, $10, $15, $20, but then decided to do that in the days after the debate, they have seen, they say, an increase in that they believe that the first week of July or so has been pretty impressive from that perspective. But when you really try to put that against what it would mean to lose or pause millions and millions of dollars, which is what they really rely on the larger big ticket donors for, that is really significant. And so they are preparing, in terms of what we're going to see in the federal election funding reports, for what we are reporting is a seismic shift in that, where fundraising really will look very different since the debate overall compared to what they had going into it. And partially that's because there had been those really huge mega fundraisers that they had done with celebrities, that they had done with former President Obama, with former President Clinton, and that kind of momentum. And now that has really stopped at this point. That could always pick up again. But when you're heading into the convention, there's a focus on that, and there's a whole team responsible for raising money for that event that is ongoing, and they are still on track because they have to get that in a lot earlier than some of these others. But I'm told even by some sources that events that they thought they could stand up in the next couple of weeks are on hold for now because organizers are pulling out or waiting. They want more information before going ahead. So you're absolutely right to point out that the fundraising is a big piece of just how a campaign operates and how they can try to pay for major ad blitzes and battleground office expansions and all of the things that really would be critical in the final stretch of a campaign. And something else, Tom, that I just noticed in that image that you have up there for viewers right now, if you see next to where the president is going to be speaking, there are clear teleprompters on that stage. So clearly, at least in his opening remarks, it appears that President Biden is going to be giving a sort of speech or some comments that are on teleprompter, that aren't unscripted like you would expect to see in a news conference. And that is likely because he wants to talk about the last couple of days at NATO. But I think that that is something that will garner some attention, given we've been talking about his ability to have these kinds of moments that are not completely scripted.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that because I did notice the teleprompter as well. We also see the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, front row. A lot of very important White House staff, cabinet members right there in the front. But again, this was because of the NATO alliance. They were in town. They were meeting with the world leaders, all that are part of NATO. Monica, I do want to ask you, this was going to start at 6:30. It slowly started to slide little by little. Those things happen with all administrations. Do we have any other reporting on why this is taking so long to get back on schedule?
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good evening. We're coming on the air with breaking news. President Biden is about to hold what could be the most important press conference of his political career. Mr. Biden under growing pressure from members of his own party to step aside in the race for president after what many have described as a disastrous debate performance 2 weeks ago today. Now the eyes of millions of voters and also his key allies inside the Democratic Party will be watching closely to see how he answers the barrage of tough questions likely to come his way in this unscripted format. This is not only the president's first press conference since that debate, but also the first solo press conference he has held in 8 months. He is certain to face questions about his age, about his health, and his ability to run for president and serve in that role for another 4 years. The president has just finished up a meeting with NATO allies here in Washington, D.C., and will likely begin with comments about what he was able to achieve during that summit. But the question looming over all of this is whether he can regain the confidence of the Democratic Party and assure lawmakers and voters he can take on Donald Trump in the race for president. Let's get right to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. He's at the president's news conference. Set the scene for us, if you will, Peter.
Lester, we are within the 2-minute warning, so we expect to see President Biden any second now. He arrives here as both commander-in-chief and a presidential candidate. And as you note, the stakes are quite high for this opportunity before the American people, the first solo news conference in 8 months, and also an opportunity to try to make up for the Democratic defections, to satisfy the anxiety of Democrats.
And here is the president.
Thank you. Please be seated. Well, good evening. We just concluded this year's NATO summit, and the consensus among the members was it was a great success. It was especially momentous because it represented the 75th year of the most important military defense alliance in the world's history of the world. We should never forget that NATO grew out of the wreckage of World War II, the most destructive war in history. The idea was to create an alliance of free and democratic nations that would commit themselves to a compact of collective defense. Standing together, they knew we'd all be safer. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And it's worked because a would-be aggressor knows if they attack one of us, they'll be attacked by all of us. Sending that message is the best way to deter aggression and prevent wars in the first place. For those who thought NATO's time had passed, they got a rude awakening when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of the oldest and deepest fears in Europe roared back to life because once again, a murderous madman was on the march. But this time, no one cowered in appeasement, especially the United States. We collected intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine months before the invasion. I directed the intelligence community to be a significant amount of intelligence be declassified so I could start building an international coalition to oppose the invasion. Then in February, some of you remember, I warned the world that the invasion was imminent. I rallied a coalition of 50 nations from Europe to Asia to help Ukraine defend itself. Many foreign policy experts thought as Putin amassed Russian forces just 100 miles north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but Putin thought it was the mother home of Russia. The capital would fall in less than a week. But the Ukrainian people, backed by a coalition to help build, stopped them. Today, Kyiv still stands, and NATO stands stronger than it has ever been. During the week of this summit, several heads of states made it a point in their statements to thank the United States and to thank me personally for all that NATO has achieved. NATO's not only stronger, NATO is bigger because we led the charge to bring in Finland and Sweden into the alliance. And it makes a gigantic difference. Excuse me. Meanwhile, my predecessor has made it clear he has no commitment to NATO. He's made it clear that he would feel no obligation to honor Article 5. He's already told Putin, and I quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." In fact, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine, here's what he said. It was genius. It was wonderful. Some of you forgot that, but that's exactly what he said. But I made it clear a strong NATO is essential to American security. And I believe the obligation of Article 5 is sacred. And I would remind all Americans, Article 5 is invoked only once in NATO's long history, and that was to defend America after 9/11. I made it clear that I will not bow down to Putin. I will not walk away from Ukraine. I will keep NATO strong. That's exactly what we did, and exactly what we'll continue to do. Now, the future of American policy is up to the American people. This is much more than the political question. It's more than that. It's a national security issue. Don't reduce this to the usual testament that people talk about, issues of being a political campaign. It's far too important. It's about the world we live in for decades to come. Every American must ask herself or himself, is the world safer with NATO? Are you safer? Is your family safer? I believe the American people know the answer to all those questions is yes. And I believe the American people understand that America is stronger because of our alliances. I believe the American consensus from Truman to Reagan to me still holds today. America cannot retreat from the world. We must lead the world. We're an indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright wrote. Now let me turn to three other key issues. Just this morning, we had a great economic report showing inflation is down. Overall prices fell last month. Core inflation is the lowest it's been in 3 years. Prices are falling for cars, appliances, and airfares. Grocery prices have fallen since the start of the year. We're going to keep working to take down corporate greed to bring those prices down further. Meanwhile, Trump's calling for a 10% tariff on everything Americans buy, including food from overseas, vegetables, and other necessities. And economists tell us that that would cost the average American working family another $2,500 a year. It's a tax of $2,500 a year. Second, our efforts to secure the border, southern border, is working. After Trump killed the bipartisan effort to secure the border, Republicans and Democrats had worked on, because he thought it would benefit me and make him a loser, Republicans walked away. So I took executive action last month. As a consequence, working with Mexico, border encounters have gone down over 50%. The current level is lower today than when Trump left office. Third, for months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close. We're making progress. The trend is positive. And I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now. Let me conclude where I began. We're the United States of America. We are the indispensable nation. Our leadership matters. Our partnerships matter. This moment matters. We must rise to meet it. With that, I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president until I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish. There's so much, we've made so much progress. Think about it. Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million jobs. So things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. Their prices, the corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down. And so I'm optimistic about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, and the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. And officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, Putin, I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is, well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was. Next one, Nancy Cordes, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned there are instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward, can't do that, it's going to cause inflation, things are going to skyrocket, the debt's going to go up. What are you hearing now from mainstream economists? 16 economic Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job. That under my plans so far and what's going to happen in the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is I decided to was able to implement as president what I believed when I was a senator. And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an economist, a mainstream economist who said we haven't done well. What have we not done that isn't working right now? And so we got more to do, though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not anti-corporate, but corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic, doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase of corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union, not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry was in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there and import what the product was. And so what did I do? I was told not to go over to to Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world and you have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is we've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming into being. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen. But it's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies all through. And by the way, red states and blue states. Matter of fact, there's as much in red states as blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fairer. And like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well, but the wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
As a follow-up, sir, you mentioned that your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you looked at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I have, I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events. Someone with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to just pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before. Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time. At the very end, I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway, I'm sorry. Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that. How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We've allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near or abroad, into Russia. Whether or not he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not, but if he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, and the weaponry we're getting to him? I've gotten a more long-range capacity, as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is where I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should and shouldn't go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or it's a matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself, and that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's gotten more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. What do we got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And you yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look, I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving? I'm not having any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. It'd be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you, from Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine, that that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine. I said, you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. That's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me? In my office, I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did. It wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. I beg your pardon? And so Finland joined NATO. 800-mile border is a significant, and they were already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe, I can't recall whether he said it publicly in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. And we're able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just met we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States, we're making the world safer and stronger because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it, and we're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where is it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi, that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit, and others raised, the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do. What they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating them. They're getting access to additional. They're not supplying weapons themselves. They're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that she believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we cannot, you have to make it clear, China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that. Remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between Xi and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that Xi understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so for example, if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well, if you want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules, and you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.
Do you have a strategy to interrupt that impact?
Yes, I do, but I'm not prepared to talk about the detail of it in public. And I think you'll see that some of our European friends are going to be curtailing their investment in Russia. In China, as long as China continues to have this indirect help to Russia in terms of being able to help their economy, as well as help them in as a consequence that their ability to fight in Ukraine. The other thing that we talked a lot about is that, and I raised it, and I didn't hear any. I can't swear that everyone agreed because not everyone got to talk about it. But we need a new industrial policy in the West. For example, we talked about how both the EU as well as NATO has to be able to begin to build their own munition capacity, has to be able to generate their own capacity to provide for weapons and the ability to, it came as a surprise to some of us how we had fallen behind in the West in terms of the ability to construct new material, new weaponry, new everything from vehicles to weapon systems. And so one of the things that came out of this was we're going to be meeting again with a number of my colleagues, my European colleagues, is what do we do to increase the capacity of the West, particularly in Europe and Japan, to be able to generate the kind of ability to produce their own weapon systems. Not just for themselves, but to be able to generate that. It's the same, it's what Russia's trying to figure out. That they went to China and they didn't get the weapons, but then they went to North Korea. But we're going to be in a position where the West is going to become the industrial base for the ability to have all the defensive weapons that we need. That was a discussion as well.
Mr. President, I'm not sure you answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now. Look, like I said, I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior. And but there isn't any world leader I'm not prepared to deal with. But I understand the generic point is Putin ready to talk? I'm not ready to talk to Putin unless Putin's ready to change his behavior. And the idea, look, Putin's got a problem. First of all, in this war that he is supposedly have won, and by the way, I think, don't hold me to the exact number, but I think that Russia had 17.3% of Ukraine that they've conquered. Now it's 17.4. I mean, in terms of percentage of territory. They've not been very successful. They've caused horrible damage and loss of life. But they've also lost over 350,000 troops, military, killed or wounded. They have over 1 million people, particularly young people with technical capability, leaving Russia because they see no future there. They've got a problem. But what they do have control of is they are very good at controlling and running the public outcry that relates to how they use mechanisms to communicate with people. They lie like hell to the constituencies. They lie like hell about what's going on. And so the idea that we're going to be able to fundamentally change Russia in the near term is not likely. But one thing for certain, if we allow Russia to succeed in Ukraine, they're not stopping in Ukraine. I recommend, I know you know this because you've written about it, read Putin's speech after they moved in, what it was all about in Kyiv. It wasn't about just, anyway, read what his objective is. And anyway, but so I think that I'm prepared to talk to any leader who wants to talk, including if Putin called me and wanted to talk. Last time I talked to Putin was trying to get him to work on an arms control agreement related to nuclear weapons in space. That didn't go very far. So my point is, I'm prepared to talk to anybody, but I don't see any inclination. There is an inclination on the part of the Chinese to keep in contact with me because they're not sure where this all goes. And look what's happened in Asia. We have strengthened the Asian Pacific area more than anyone else has. We just put together with today. I brought on. I asked our NATO allies that we bring on the group from the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. I already mentioned Australia. And I met twice now, I think, with the 14 leaders of the Pacific Island nations. And we've slowed down what's going on there. We've slowed down China's reach. But there's a lot of work to do. This is a moving target, and I don't take it lightly. Assam from NPR.
Thank you, Mr. President. Asma Khalid with NPR. I have two questions. Earlier, you spoke about the ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. We're now looking at 10 months of war, and I'm curious if there's anything that you feel personally you wish you would have done differently over the course of the war. And then secondly, if I may, I wanted to ask you about your presidential campaign. I remember covering your campaign in 2020, and there was a moment where you referred to yourself as a, quote, bridge candidacy, a transition to a younger generation of leaders. I want to understand what changed.
Two things. Let's go back to when you talked about would I have changed anything that's happening with Israel and the Palestinians and the Palestinian movement. The answer is, as you recall, from the very beginning, I went to Israel, but I also got immediate contact with al-Sisi in Egypt. I met with the King of Jordan. I met with most of the Arab leaders to try to get a consensus going as to what had to be done to deal with getting more aid and food and medicine into the Gaza Strip. And we pushed it really hard. And Israel occasionally was less than cooperative, number one. The Israeli War Cabinet, I've been dealing with Israel since Golda Meir. Some of the reporters around here cover me all the time have heard me say this. The first time I met with Golda Meir, I sat across from her on her desk, and her assistant was Rabin sitting next to me. That's how far back I go. I know Israel well, and I support Israel. But this war cabinet is one of the most conservative war cabinets in the history of Israel. And there's no ultimate answer other than a two-state solution here. And so what was able to be done in terms of the plan I put together was it would be a process for a two-state solution. And we get the Arab nations to, particularly from Egypt all the way to Saudi Arabia, to be in a position where they would cooperate in the transition so that they could keep the peace in Gaza without Israeli forces staying in Gaza. The question has been from the beginning, what's the day after in Gaza? And the day after in Gaza has to be, the end of the day after has to be no occupation by Israel on the Gaza Strip, as well as the ability for us to access get in and out as rapidly as you can, all that's needed there. I've been disappointed that some of the things that I've put forward have not succeeded as well, like the port we attached from Cyprus. I was hopeful that would be more successful. But that's why when I went to Israel immediately after the massacres that occurred at the hands of Hamas, the one thing I said to the Israelis, and I met with the War Cabinet and with Bibi, don't make the same mistake America made after bin Laden. There's no need to occupy anywhere. Go after the people who did the job. You may recall, I still get criticized for it, but I was totally opposed to the occupation and trying to unite Afghanistan. Once we got bin Laden, we should have moved on, because it was not in our. No one's ever going to unite that country. I've been over every inch of that, not every inch, the entirety from the poppy fields all the way to the north. I said, don't make the same mistake we made. Don't think that's what you should be doing, is doubling down. We'll help you find the bad guys, Sinwar and company. And all this criticism about I wouldn't provide when the weapons they needed. I'm not providing them 2,000-pound bombs. They cannot be used in Gaza or any populated area without causing great human tragedy and damage. But remember what happened when you had the attack on Israel with rockets and ballistic missiles. I was able to unite the Arab nations as well as Europe, and nothing happened. Nothing got hurt. It sent an incredible lesson to what was going on from the Middle East. So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. But the bottom line is we have a chance now. It's time to end this war. Doesn't mean walk away from going after Sinwar and Hamas. And if you notice, you know better than most, there is a growing dissatisfaction on the West Bank from the Palestinians about Hamas. Hamas is not popular now. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I just have to keep moving to make sure that we get as much done as we can toward a ceasefire, and get those. And by the way, look at the numbers in Israel. I mean, my numbers are better in Israel than they are here. But then again, they're better than a lot of other people here too. But anyway.
Bridge candidacy in 2020. You referred to yourself as being a bridge candidate for a younger, fresher generation of Democratic leaders, and I wanted to know what changed.
What changed was the gravity of the situation I inherited in terms of the economy, our foreign policy, and domestic division. And I think, I won't put words in anybody's mouth, most presidential historians give me credit for having accomplished more than most any president since Johnson and maybe before that to get major pieces of legislation passed. And what I realized was my long time in the Senate had equipped me to have the wisdom to know how to deal with the Congress to get things done. We got more major legislation passed that no one thought would happen. And I want to finish it, to get that finished. If tomorrow, if we had a circumstance where there was a lineup and I hadn't inherited what I did and we just moved things along, anyway, it's going to change.
Last question.
Haley Bull, Scripps. Or no, Josh Weingrove, I'm sorry, was the next one. I'll do two more questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Many of your colleagues, Democrats on the Hill, are watching tonight as they assess what they want to say about your candidacy. I'm wondering how you're thinking of this right now. It seems like your answer is clear, but they're watching how things go tonight, tomorrow in Michigan, next week in Texas and Nevada. Are you thinking that way about how the next week or two goes would inform you?
Am I using that way, you said?
Are you thinking that way about how the next 2 weeks go? Will that affect your decision, or are you fully determined on running in November as the party's nominee?
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events from Wisconsin to North Carolina to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win, where we can persuade people to move our way, or people are already there. And here, look, the other thing is, we have the most extensive campaign organization of anybody's had in a long, long time. We have well over 1,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, making tens of thousands of phone calls. We have headquarters. I forget exactly how many. I don't want to cite a number and then find out I'm off. But we have scores of headquarters in all the toss-up states. We're organized. We're moving, and that's awful hard to replace in the near term. And so, and here's the other thing. I was in the Senate a long time. Very proud of what I've done in the Senate. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for a long time, and I was chairman or ranking member and chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I'm going to be going down to the Johnson Library. Anyway, I'm going to be going around making the case of the things that I think we have to finish and how we can't afford to lose what we've done or backslide on civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights. There's that little button we have. Control guns, not girls. I mean, the idea we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around. More children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We've got a candidate saying, promise the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. You got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous. There's so much we can do still, and I'm determined to get it done. It's about freedom. And by the way, I'll end this. Well, I'm not going to do that. Haley has to come up too. But I remember I made a speech on democracy in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. And I'm not being critical, just observing. The bulk of the press said, what the hell is he talking about that for? Democracy. You did. Democracy is not an issue. Democracy is not an issue. Except the polling data showed 60% of the people knew I was right, thought I was right. I'm not asking you a question. You don't have to answer, obviously. But do you think our democracy is under siege based on this court? Do you think democracy is under siege based on Project 2025? Do you think he means what he says when he says he's going to do away with the civil service, eliminate the Department of Education, make sure? I mean, we've never been here before. And that's the other reason why you say, hand off to another generation. I've got to finish this job. I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake.
We've had some discussions over the past few days with your press secretary about the question of health exams. And you said you take a cognitive test every day in this job. Are you open to taking another physical or test before the election? Governor Whitmer of Michigan, for instance, said it wouldn't hurt to take a test.
Well, look, two things. One, I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity to do decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember when the staff and I said, I'm going to go to South Korea. We're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand it. You know, the only thing age does is help you with it. Creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention. And so the point I'm making is, I think it's important that if the neurologist tells me he thinks I need another exam, and by the way, I've laid every bit of the record out. Hadn't a thing. You ought to ask Trump for his, okay? I laid it all out. And every single day, I'm surrounded by good docs. If they think there's a problem, I promise you, or even if they don't think it's a problem, they think I should have a neurological exam again, I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now. And I'll ask you another question. No matter what I did, no one's going to be satisfied. Did you have 7 docs? Did you have 2? Who'd you have? Did you do this? How many times did you? So I am not opposed if my doctors tell me I should have another neurological exam. I'll do it. But that's where I am. Haley Bull, Scripps.
Thank you, Mr. President. You said you're making decisions on a day-to-day basis when it comes to support for Ukraine. Does that mean you have not closed the door on further considering lifting restrictions for U.S.-made weapons inside Russia? And if I may, your convention is coming up where your delegates are pledged to make you the official nominee. If they have second thoughts, are they free to vote their conscience?
Obviously, they're free to do whatever they want, but I get overwhelming support. Overwhelming support. I won, I forget how many votes I won in the primary. Overwhelming. And so tomorrow, if all of a sudden I show up at the convention, everybody says, we want somebody else, that's the democratic process. It's not going to happen.
Even if that means they vote for someone else?
Sure. Look, I'll end this with this. I served in the Senate a long time. I understand the impetus of candidates running for local office and whether they think the topic they can help them or not. In my state of Delaware, which was a very, at least it was a red state when I started, in terms of where you now talk red and blue. I don't recall most of the Democratic presidents winning my state when I was a candidate. The truth of the matter is I understand the self-interest of every candidate. If they think that, running with Biden at the top is going to hurt them, then they're going to run away. I get it. But so far, go and look at the polling data in their states. Look at the in-depth, and by the way, I think you'd all acknowledge, and you're all experts. I'm not being solicitous about the president. You're experts on this stuff. How accurate does anybody think the polls are these days? I can give you a series of polls where you have likely voters, me versus Trump, where I win all the time. When the unlikely voters vote, he wins sometimes. The bottom line is all the polling data right now, which I think is premature because the campaign really hasn't even started. I mean, it hadn't started in earnest yet. Most of the time, it doesn't start till after September, after Labor Day. So a lot can happen. But I think I'm the best I believe I'm the best qualified to govern. And I think I'm the best qualified to win. But there are other people who could beat Trump too. But it's awful start from scratch. And, we talk about, money raised. We're not doing bad. We got about $220 million in the bank. We're doing well. So with that, you have want to follow up on any of that you just asked me?
Yes. You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that.
Mr. President,
Okay.
This ends tonight's press conference. Thanks, everybody. This concludes.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
This concludes tonight's press conference. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
President.
That was an NBC News special report. President Biden's news conference just finishing. More coverage next. Top story starts right now. We are coming on the air with breaking news. The major story of the day, President Biden speaking to the press amid growing calls for him to drop out of the 2024 race. The entire country watching to see how President Biden would handle this big test. Off the bat, the president with a major blunder when asked about how he feels about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Trump if she were on the ticket.
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The president later seemingly losing his place when responding to another reporter.
How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is, well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was.
The backdrop of all of this, new explosive reporting from NBC News and the New York Times, cracks in the president's support now reaching the president's inner circle. Several of the president's longtime aides saying they no longer see a viable route to re-election. One campaign official going as far as saying, quote, he needs to drop out and he will never recover from this. And as questions and accusations swirl over his fitness for office, earlier tonight, President Biden caught in a jarring moment, mistakenly calling Ukrainian President Zelensky President Putin.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
And this stunning development, NBC confirming that the Biden campaign is quietly assessing how Vice President Kamala Harris would fare if she were to go up against Trump. At this hour, more lawmakers are coming forward saying it's time for President Biden to bow out. We're following all the latest developments on the heels of that consequential news conference. Monica Alba joins us now. Monica, a couple questions for our viewers, right? If you were tuning into this, you don't really understand the machinations of how the White House works, how they decide who gets to ask questions. How were the reporters selected for this conference? And did they put a cap on who and how many people could ask questions?
Well, I have to tell you, Tom, that the president did take questions for a little close to an hour. He had those opening remarks, and then he pivoted to really taking those questions from at least 8 different questioners. And then even at the end, he called on 2 reporters and said that he would not just wrap it up with one, but let the other one. And I should point out that multiple of those reporters, my colleagues in the White House press corps, had follow-up. So he really did answer dozens of questions if you take the follow-up into account. And at the very end, I thought it was notable that he did take a shouted question from our colleague, Peter Alexander, who asked him about that clear stumble where he incorrectly referred to his vice president as Vice President Trump. And Peter posed that question to the president, saying, what did you mean, essentially, and did you realize that? And referring back to the point that already we're seeing Donald Trump and his allies and his campaign seize on that moment. And in response, President Biden said to Peter, listen to him. And that is a big, big message that the whole White House and Biden re-election effort wants to be the takeaway from this news conference. They want to turn the page. They're trying to on that disastrous debate performance and put it back on the presumptive Republican nominee. And that is why you saw President Biden in his opening remarks talk about NATO in the context of what Donald Trump has said about President Putin and about the defense alliance more generally. He also put it into the context of other foreign policy challenges and really tried to make this about a contrast between his position and vision for a second term and what Donald Trump might do if he is to win back the White House. But overall, Tom, as you saw there, the president extremely defiant, saying, look, I'm going to stay in this race. I understand why people have certain concerns. He says that they are valid. He says that he understands. He even conceded that if his neurologist suggested that he should have another extensive examination like the one he did earlier this year, that he would do that, which is something that stood out as well, given all the questions about his age and his health right now.
Yeah, and we're going to have to wait and see how voters saw his stamina, how they saw his energy, how they saw his cadence, how they heard this speech. He did have one moment there towards the end of the news conference that you mentioned. I want to play for our viewers now in case they missed it, basically asking what would happen at the convention if the pledged delegates to President Biden decided they didn't want him to be the nominee. Listen to that.
Tomorrow, if all of a sudden I show up at the convention, everybody says we want somebody else, that's the democratic process. It's not going to happen.
So President Biden, as you mentioned, they're defiant, right? Essentially saying that this is not happening, even though the reporting coming from NBC, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, various other news organizations, that people in his inner circle and also other Democrats maybe want him to step down, maybe want another candidate. I want to play another moment for you. This is something he said during the news conference. You cover President Biden day in, day out. You've been covering him every step of the way since the debate. He said this about major events that he's been hosting since the debate. I want to play for our viewers now. Okay, we're going to give him a second to cue that up. It's the 20 major events. It's ready to go. Let's go.
And where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events. Some with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to pace myself a little more.
Monica, is that the case? Is the president hosting 20 events? Is that fair? Is it around there? Was he being truthful?
Look, I think he's trying to combine a couple of things here, Tom. He's talking about the fact that he did hit the campaign trail after the debate. He was traveling a little bit. Then he did do a handful of radio interviews. Then he was back and traveling again. And so he's taking all of those individual engagements and, let's say, maybe a stop at a restaurant like a Waffle House, and probably counting that as one of those things, in addition to then giving a speech in a battleground state, in addition to then these engagements that he has had at NATO over the last couple of days. So if you add up all those things,
but not 20, right? But not 20 major campaign events. Yeah. I understand now. Since you mentioned the radio interviews, I know there's some new reporting on that. What exactly has happened, and what's been uncovered with some of those radio interviews?
Yeah, and I think what's notable about those is that they have really generated more controversy in the way they were handled than the actual substance of what was said in those interviews. He did them right before the 4th of July, and in those interviews, he conceded that he had screwed up, that he had made a mistake, that he had had a terrible debate night. But what we learned after the fact is that, in fact, some staffers from the Biden campaign and from the White House had apparently suggested interview questions to those radio hosts, and some of them were taken and essentially asked pretty verbatim. And so that's one development. And then in a separate development, also related to those radio interviews, Tom, we understand that the campaign asked them to edit out a portion of something that the president had said during the interview because they didn't happen live to air. They were taped to then later be released at another time. And that is something apparently that this radio station did, though they said that wasn't up to their journalistic and ethical standards.
Monica Alba, terrific reporting from the get-go. We appreciate having you on tonight. I want to get right over to our chief political analyst, Chuck Todd, who joins us now. Chuck, your first thoughts after watching that. I have a series of other questions for you, but I want to get your initial opinion from watching it.
Well, look, if there wasn't the debate, right, if that had never happened, this would have been fine and somewhat perfunctory, right? It would have been sort of, frankly, what we've come to expect from these public performances by the president. Some slip-ups here. He clearly, on the topics and on the substance, he knows this stuff. I think the reaction you're going to get, though, is really a Rorschach test. If you are looking for a reason to break with him, you can find some instances to say, look, while he knows the topics, can he really go toe-to-toe with Trump? He still is allergic to the word abortion. He finds a million different ways, even, to vaguely talk about it, right? So if you're
Chuck,
looking
explain
for
that point, Chuck. I think that's important. Explain what you mean there.
About the specific on abortion?
Yeah, explain that.
Well, look at it. He talked about, when he was talking about the strengths of Kamala Harris, he started saying freedom for women's bodies, and then it was control guns, not girls, right? He'll make allusions to it, but it's clear, and it drives a lot of Democrats, particularly in these swing states, crazy that he can't say the words abortion ban or abortion or anything like that, or abortion rights. So, my point is if you want to feel better about Biden, or at least tell yourself, hey, he's good enough, I think this press conference you could say, okay, yes, he can lead the ticket, but I don't think he allayed any concerns about his ability for all 4 years. And I think that, look, I think there were some questions that could have been asked more directly about that, about all 4 years. I do think it's notable what he said at the very end, when he said that if his team came to him and said there was no path to victory, he would take that into consideration. And then he quickly said, but there's no evidence of that, right? It's not true. I think if you're looking for, is he leaving the door open to be persuaded to get out? Perhaps that answer at the end, you could hang your hat on that. But I'll tell you this, before this press conference, it did feel as if, boy, is he going to survive the weekend? Look, he's digging in. If Democrats really want him out, they're going to have to do a pilgrimage. They're going to have to be more public, and they're going to have to, 100 of them are going to have to come out from Capitol Hill, I think, before he's going to budge here. And I don't know if there's 100 elected Democrats that have the stomach for that.
But Chuck, you say it was a Rorschach test, and I want to ask our great director, Brett Holy, to get this answer lined up when it was asked directly about Harris's qualifications, right. Vice President Harris. I do want to ask you, when you have a candidate for office, an incumbent, who is debating whether or not to take a neurological test and saying that he is open to taking a neurological test, aren't you essentially saying or signaling we may be in some real trouble here with voters?
Well, look, I think this is the problem he's facing here, is that this is the number one issue voters have decided is a huge concern for them, and it's been this way for a year. Our own polling has shown it. Plenty of polling has shown it. There's people that claim that somehow this hasn't been reported in the mainstream media. It's not true. I think this is why there's widespread concern about whether can he serve another 4 years. And if that is your test, if you're trying to figure that out, if your test is, can he lead this ticket for the next 4 months? Or should your test be, can he serve another 4 years, right, in this capacity? And I think that those might be two different questions that certain Democrats are asking themselves here on that point. But I'll tell you, for me, I don't think he did enough to answer the question about his ability to serve the next 4 years. He actually quite cleverly didn't answer the question about his ability to go one-on-one with Putin 2 years from now, 3 years from now. He
He also
you got to give him credit for
he also had this moment where he essentially said he was trying out. That the next couple of weeks, like he was trying out to assure voters who had fears that, listen, I can still do this. Here's what he said when he was asked about Vice President Harris's qualifications.
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her.
It wasn't a ringing endorsement of a list of qualifications of what she's done since vice president, but was it enough?
Again, I think, look, I do for him. I think if you've noticed, a lot of his answers were that he would start with sounded like he was going to give a laundry list, and then he'd sort of stop in the middle. Well, whatever, right? It's sort of been a tick. But I want to sort of step back here. This really is the fault of how the White House has handled him and handled this. I go back to something, Tom, and I think you've talked about this before. Had they, I think the inner circle looks at this performance and says, oh, it was fine because that's the Biden we used to every day. Well, because they're with him all the time. But because they bubble wrapped him over the last 2 years and were very reticent to put him out in any unscripted moments, and there have only been recently have they even been doing more unscripted moments, I think it's still a shock to a lot of American people when they're watching this. I think if they had been putting him out there over the last 2 years and letting the public get as used to him as they are, he might be in a different situation. There might be supporters of his that are giving him more benefit of the doubt. But right now, you've got Democrats who are just scared of Donald Trump, and they want somebody who's a fighter. And the problem is, I think that while substantively, you can argue that he's on top of everything he should be trying to campaign on. The question you have to ask yourself is, can he make the case out there? Can he go out there on the stump and do this for 100 straight days between now and November?
The argument
there's a lot of questions about that.
The argument he was putting forth is the same as campaign managers did to Senate Democrats, right? If you look at the polling, battleground states, it's within the margin of error. It's still an incredibly tight race. Is that enough, you think, to convince? I don't even know what to call them anymore, right? Because you have the president who's calling them elite Democrats, but the establishment Democrats, any Democrat, if you have a D, if you're a liberal, is that enough to convince them to stop I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's organic, if it's a groundswell, if it's a revolution. It seems like a small trickle of elected Democrats that are coming out there when you think of the vast majority. But it feels like the last 2 days there's been definitely a sea change. Is the argument, though, enough to stop that?
Well, here's the question I would pose to them. Tell me how you're going to make this election all about Donald Trump when there are so many questions about your ability to serve the next 4 years. And can he make this campaign over the next 100 plus days more about Trump than himself? And I think that's what a lot of these swing state Democrats are nervous about, that they look at it and say, this is way too much a referendum on Biden, and Democrats don't believe they can win a referendum on Biden election. The only way this is winnable for all of them is they want it to be a referendum on a return of Trump. But has Biden introduced too many of his own variables and own questions about his ability to do all 4 years? Is that going to be, frankly, a distraction from their ability to laser beam focus on all things Trump? And I get why they're concerned that Biden's just not going to be strong enough to pivot like this.
All right, Chuck Todd, stand by for us. We want to get to Peter Alexander. He was in the room. He got ultimately the last question. The president sort of answered him. Peter, we're going to play that exchange you had with the president. Brett, let's roll that.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
Peter, you can pick it up from there. Your thoughts. You were there for every moment of that. What do you think?
For experience.
as a prosecutor? Well, Tom, I have a couple of thoughts. Let's start with that moment that you just revisited at the end of the news conference here. Obviously, it was at the beginning of this news conference where the stakes, as we note, cliche, but they could not be higher. And it was its opening answer where the president mistakenly said Vice President Trump when referring to Vice President Harris. I'm seated in the second row right behind some of the president's top aides and advisors. And I have to tell you, there was an audible gasp from reporters in the room, and even one of the president's top aides. I saw him just bow his head and just take a very deep breath. I think they recognized the potential damage from a simple moment like that, and within minutes it was already ricocheting around social media, certainly being amplified by conservatives, Donald Trump Jr., Donald Trump himself. So I wanted to get at the end of this news conference a question to the president on that topic. We locked eyes, and his response, as you heard, was listen to him. So I think in some ways he's hoping to sort of put that to bed, but I would suggest that that is going to be one of the major headlines of this, one of the moments from this that people will be talking about tomorrow and in the days ahead. I think you have two things to think about here. First, performatively, the president, absent that gaffe, I think most people will say he performed pretty well. I'm hearing from a Biden aide already saying if this Joe Biden had showed up at that debate 2 weeks ago, they wouldn't be, in this aide's words, in the mess that they are in right now. But substantively, I think a lot of people will feel also, those of his supporters, those Democrats in particular, like he demonstrated a real, a deep understanding about the complexities of foreign policy, talking about China and Israel, Hamas, Gaza, and Russia and Ukraine. So I think there's going to be a little confirmation bias. If you think he needed to step aside, it's likely you still believe that. If you think that he has what it takes to be president for 4 more years, I suspect you probably feel that way as well. I will say that I heard from a top Democratic aide just as this news conference wrapped up. They were responding to my specific question to the president. I asked them if this changed anything, and they said simply nope. They said it will not be enough to satisfy those House and Senate Democrats who were prepared to come forward saying that President Biden should step aside. And already, I didn't get to hear the top of your conversation, but already we are now hearing from another Democrat, Connecticut's Democrat Jim Himes, the House Democrat, saying immediately after the news conference ended that he believes that Joe Biden should step aside, should allow there to be another nominee. So clearly this did not stem the tide of Democratic defections. Tom?
Peter, I think sometimes it's important to pause, right, and explain to the viewers the process. We're used to this, right, because we cover the president. You, at the end of the news conference, had to get up and sort of shout your question, right? Explain to our viewers, how were the people selected to ask questions, and why was there sort of a limit? Because people may be asking themselves, great reporters like yourself from NBC, ABC, CNN, they didn't get a chance to ask questions at this consequential news conference. Explain to our viewers why that happens.
Well, I mean, there were probably 100 reporters in here, so I recognize that not everybody's going to get a chance to ask a question. Certainly, I would have liked to and ultimately got to at the end here. But generally, pulling back the curtain, the reporters ask the White House. They say, I'm going to be in attendance and I'd like to ask a question. And the White House decides for itself who's going to get those questions. And you likely don't know until the president calls on you. So reporters like me have to be prepared either way. I do think the questions did address a lot of the major topics that needed to be addressed in the course of this. The president at the very end seemed to leave the door open to the possibility of stepping aside if he was shown evidence that Kamala Harris could beat Donald Trump and that there was evidence that he could not. He then dismissed that, saying that that's not going to happen here. But, you know, the president did speak for, what was it, roughly an hour, perhaps a little more than an hour tonight in this news conference. If this was an effort to try to demonstrate stamina, I think on that front, after a very long several days dealing with world leaders here at the NATO summit that he is the host of, I think he'll satisfy issues that may have related to the topic of stamina. But I do think, you know, beyond that, obviously, people are now going to see this in digested pieces. They're going to see it on the internet. Clips like that first mistake, that gaffe, are going to play all over the place. And before he arrived here, he had another mistake where he accidentally, as he spoke to it, referred to President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, as President Vladimir Putin of Russia. He quickly corrected it, but those are moments that if you see them in small snippets, I think will only underscore the real concerns that presently exist about this president, given given the real issues right now in terms of his candidacy and the topic of his mental and physical preparedness.
And we
to serve
should
another 4
point
years.
out that a lot of the questions that were asked were from foreign news agencies because he is hosting that NATO summit. Peter Alexander, phenomenal reporting as always. We want to bring in our political pros now. Hogan Gidley, Republican strategist and former Trump White House Deputy Press Secretary, and Michael Starr Hopkins, a Democratic strategist and who has served on the Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton presidential campaigns. Both men, good friends to Top Story. Great to have you here. Michael, I'm going to start with you. How did President Biden do?
It was a good performance. The problem with the good performance is it puts Democrats into an even tougher position because that debate wasn't an outlier. It was more of an indicator of the problem that's been resting just under the sea level for this party. Moving forward, I think you're still going to see a number of Democrats come out tomorrow that were holding off because of NATO. He can't fix the problem.
Wait, Michael, let me stop you right there. They're going to come out and do what?
Are going to come out and say that it's time for him to step aside. I've been talking to some Hill staffers as well as some members of the CBC who have publicly said that they're with Biden. And as we get closer to NATO ending, and now that this press conference is over, I expect many of them to come out in the next couple of days because the press conference alone can't stop.
From the Congressional Black Caucus, is that what you're saying?
Yes, from the Congressional Black Caucus.
That would be a huge blow to the president, right? Because as we know, we've talked about it on our show a lot, you cannot win this election if you're a Democrat, if you don't have the coalition of voters like black voters, Hispanic voters. That would be a pretty big event if that does happen. You think that's going to happen?
I do. If you look at the fact that Congressman Jeffries has the opportunity to be the first black speaker, and a lot of CBC members have been celebrating this and really looking forward to it. If the polls continue to be true, Democrats aren't just going to miss that opportunity, but the Republicans are going to capture the House by 10, 20 seats. And so I think you're now going to start to see more CBC members come out in hopes that we can stop the bleeding and Speaker Jeffries or soon-to-be Speaker Jeffries, if we're able to course correct.
Michael, we know President Biden needed a home run tonight. How did he do at the plate?
I would say that this was a double. The problem is that every day he's got to be perfect. And there's no way that any candidate can do that. Like Peter Alexander was saying, the story today is going to be the 2 incidences where he mixed up the names. It's not going to be that he spoke for an hour and was able to really articulate a clear message. It's going to be those 2 moments.
Yeah, especially on complicated foreign policy issues. Hogan Gidley, you know how the Trump campaign is going to handle this. It has already started. Exactly what Michael just said there. The tweets are out there. They're just honing in on all the mistakes, and they're going to pump social media with that. What else do they do with this news conference?
Well, I think Michael's absolutely right. And if the Congressional Black Caucus begins to fracture and show that there's cracks in that dam for their support for Joe Biden, that's a huge story and would be a massive shift. And I think Joe Biden would have some serious trouble. At the end of the day, though, I still think the dust settles and Joe Biden stays in. They rally the troops and they try to do what they can to salvage, the sagging poll numbers and the sagging candidacy of Joe Biden. But this was a bad night, I think, for Biden, but it wasn't bad enough to, I think, push him out of this race. I think Democrats have a tough time now. Michael's absolutely right about that, too, because if he'd have fallen on his face completely, we'd be having another conversation. But he came out, the bar was set very low, and everyone was watching this not to find out what he would say about a topic. They just wanted to find out if he could talk about the topic at all. He did achieve that. Of course, there were flubs along the way. These are flubs that we've kind of come to know and expect from Joe Biden for the last 4 years. I don't think that's the story, though. I think the real story is Trump is going to look at this as a win. I think he should, because it puts the Democrats in further turmoil. And I think Democrats are going to be in a weird spot here because it was a win for Biden. And now they have a tough time coming out and calling for his ouster when he just put up a performance like that.
You've worked with a lot of candidates whose maybe their campaigns are on the ropes. Did it sound like President Biden was projecting strength? Did it sound like he was staying in this race as you think he's going to do? Or did it sound like he was maybe listening and opening the door to possibly dropping out if the entire party turns on him?
There were a couple moments I did think he was kind of seeding the ground, if you will, when he talked so glowingly about Kamala and why he picked her in the first place. You know, that there could be a switch, and he was trying to make that a possibility. But then he doubled down even more on him staying in the race. There were some awkward moments with reporters. I thought, boy, did they give him a soft glove tonight. No real questions about his health that were of any significance. I mean, the toughest question, I think, came from Peter Alexander, who stood up and just basically pointed out the flub he made that was so problematic to set the tone for that press conference and set Twitter ablaze, of course. But look, I think for the most part, we're kind of back to status quo here. It's going to be an interesting next few days for the Democrats as we head into Milwaukee for the Republican convention.
Michael, what do you think happens?
Look, pride's a hell of a thing, and you've seen the president double down about staying in. But at the end of the day, this is going to be about donor money. When John Morgan, when George Clooney, if Jeffrey Katzenberg all cut off money to candidates, especially at the top of the ticket, it's going to be devastating. And as you look at more down ballot candidates, look at the polls and see that the president's going to be a drag on the ticket, there's going to be those calls. And those calls aren't going to stop. They're going to pick up, especially now that NATO's over. It was a good performance, but it can't save him.
Michael Starr Hopkins, Hogan Gidley, always a pleasure to talk to you guys. I want to get to my good friend Hallie Jackson, who's been standing by for us. She was watching every minute of that news conference as well. Hallie, we've heard from our White House reporters, right? Both Monica and Peter. We heard from Chuck Todd, and we've heard from our political pros. I'm curious to get
your... You're probably good, Tom.
Yeah, they're good. It's good. The tough show to follow, right? Tough act to follow. I do want to ask you, though, what you think, right? Because the most important people that this matters to are the voters, right? And what did the voters see that night? What did they want to see, and did President Biden deliver for them?
It really depends on which voters you talk to, right? Think about this moment, though, for President Biden. You don't get opportunities in prime time on network television across all the networks to speak to the American people all that often, right? That is fairly rare. Of course, the last opportunity President Biden had to do that was exactly 2 weeks ago tonight, and that was his debate performance that's been widely panned as disastrous. That's what put him in the political crisis that he's in now. So it depends on the voters that you talk to. I will tell you that you're seeing kind of a variety of it. We have these amazing embeds, as you know, who are planted in different places all around the country. They're talking with voters. Democratic voters in particular, some of whom are suggesting that they are with Joe Biden because they believe that the alternative is so much worse. Now, the polling, if you're going to look at it not just anecdotally, but quantitatively, if you will, the polling suggests, of course, that President Biden still narrowly trails in what is a very close race. And I have to caveat that many of the polls are inside the margin of error in some of these key battlegrounds. Yep. You can look at national polling, sure, but these races, as you well know, are won and lost in these half a dozen key states. Former President Trump leads in many of them, again, inside the margin of error for almost all, except I think Pennsylvania. And the Biden campaign sources that I talked to there say, listen, this is still very close. They haven't seen a ton of meaningful movement away from President Biden since that debate performance. So that brings us to tonight, right? Another moment now on the primetime stage in front of Americans in this big audience here. And I'll tell you what I heard from one current Democratic member who said this is kind of like an ink blot test, right? If you came into tonight and you were on the side of Joe Biden, you wanted to see him stay in this race, you probably didn't see anything to make you change your mind. You're probably feeling okay. If you wanted the president to withdraw his name from the ticket, there's probably not much that you saw tonight that made you change your mind either, right? So here we have this. It seems for now, bit of a status quo. Now, I say that with the caveat that who knows what could happen tomorrow, the next day. I'm sure you've already talked about Congressman Himes, who has now come out in the seconds after that news conference to say that he thinks President Biden should step off the ticket. You may start to see more of that drumbeat now that the NATO summit is over and now that those world leaders have left. Tom.
You know, two important moments, I think, from this news conference that should be huge takeaways. One, we had a sitting president, the incumbent, who is debating, taking questions on whether to take a neurological test at this moment right now in the campaign, when really you should start to think about your closing arguments to voters, right? It's almost like the president right now is at the start of this campaign. And two, the only other Democrat mentioned is, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris. And we have some new reporting from Yamiche Alcindor, talking to her sources, talking to Democrats close to Kamala Harris, saying what the president said tonight was great for her because they showed that he is completely behind her and that she's qualified, if this were to happen, to be in that pole position, to be the first one lined up on the ticket. How big of a night was this for the vice president, do you think?
She has been walking this very sort of delicate tightrope, I think, behind the scenes. Publicly, obviously, full-throated support for President Biden. But, she's at the center of all this speculation on what would happen if he did come off the ticket, were she to be, in fact, the nominee. I mean, to the point where there's speculation in the rumor mill, the Beltway rumor mill is going about who would be Kamala Harris's running mate this November if, in fact, she were to get on the ticket. I mean, I think there are some folks who are 10 steps down the path right now when we haven't even, President Biden has not even opened that door because he says he's staying in it. So I think, obviously, of course, it's, Vice President Harris is, I'm sure, undoubtedly happy to hear that President Biden has confidence in her. But if he didn't have confidence in her, he probably wouldn't have put her on the ticket in the first place to be his vice president, given the relationship there that any president has with their vice president moving forward. I would go you one more macro, so to speak, Tom. And that way I'd pull back even more, because you talked about how interesting this is. In your view, one of your key takeaways was the way that this feels like a moment when you should be making your closing argument, not your opening argument. Just to take a beat here, sort of the world that we're in right now, where you have the sitting president of the United States conducting a news conference that focused in large part on his ability to even serve in office, that touched on his bedtime, that touched on, some of these things that are, well within the arena of fair play for questions, given that Democrats, remember, the calls coming from inside the House, Democrats have raised these concerns. But this is a pretty extraordinary moment in American politics, whatever happens from here, whether President Biden remains on the ticket as he hopes to do or whether he comes off it.
Hallie Jackson for us. Hallie, always great to have you. We thank you for that. We're going to have much more on the president's news conference in just a moment. We're going to take a very quick break. We'll be right back.
Now is raw. How hard is it to see it like this?
Our house is no longer here, but we are here.
Now is real.
Let's break down what we know and then the big questions still outstanding.
News for the generation of now is NBC News Now.
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out, for the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events from Wisconsin to North Carolina to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win, where we can persuade people to move our way, or people are already there. And then look, the other thing is, we have the most extensive campaign organization of anybody's had in a long, long time. We have well over 1,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, making tens of thousands of phone calls. We have headquarters, I forget exactly how many, I want to cite a number and then find out I'm off, but we have scores of headquarters in all the toss-up states. We're organized, we're moving, and that's awful hard to replace in the near term.
That was President Biden at that news conference that just recently wrapped up. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli covers President Biden for us. He's covered him for a very long time. He's one of the most well-sourced reporters covering President Biden right now. What are your sources telling you, Mike, about the news conference that we just witnessed?
Well, Tom, in the White House, the campaign knows how important this moment was. They have seen a lot of important moments coming that he has failed to deliver on. Of course, first and foremost, that debate and some of the moments since, and they know there are going to be other tests for him to come. The question really is, what does President Biden think at this moment? And I think tonight we heard indications of course, his intention to stay in this race. But, Tom, I thought some of the most interesting and important parts were the potential openings he laid to exiting this race. He talked about the possibility that his team could give him polling data that shows that Vice President Harris could win and that he could not. He said he hasn't seen it yet, but that's possible. He talked about members of the delegates to the Democratic National Convention potentially being open to vote their conscience. He doesn't expect that they will vote for somebody other than him, but at the moment, he is giving them that indication. And so, yeah, Mike, for somebody who is 100% in until he's 100% out, I think we heard tonight he's 100% in still, but I wouldn't foreclose that he is open to the introspection.
Mike, let's spend some time on that, right? Because you know, again, President Biden better than maybe any other reporter on this planet. When you listen to that, because I picked up on that as well, but it's, other people hear different things. Did you think that was him sort of slightly opening the door? Or, because some people have said President Biden, especially since he is now the leader of the free world, he can do pretty much whatever he wants. He can also be very stubborn. It was surprising to me. Did you read it the same way?
Well, we saw flashes of the different Joe Bidens, right? We saw that scrappy kid from Scranton who is geared up for a fight. He knows he's fighting for his political career. He got his voice raised at certain points, especially talking about gun violence. You can see that he still thinks he is the best person, as he put it, in this order, to govern and to win. But I also did see the Joe Biden that a lot of Democrats really have such a well of empathy and goodwill towards, and they want to see him end this the right way. They want to see him go out. He said he's not doing this for his legacy. He's doing this because he thinks he needs to finish the job. And I think the days ahead are going to be so critical. For instance, Jim Clyburn, who is as important to his current position being in the White House as anybody, going to be on the Today Show tomorrow morning. What will he say? How did he view tonight? That's a voice President Biden will listen to. He's going to spend the weekend with his family again in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. What kind of thoughts are they having now that we're 2 weeks into this moment of political crisis for the family? Have they gone through a process where they think his future, his legacy might be better served by him stepping aside? I think President Biden has gone through a range of emotions over these past 2 weeks. He's gone through a range of possibilities. The fact that he knows how important it was to set up Vice President Harris and for success potentially if she has to step in is important. And the fact that he showed a little bit of recognition that there could be a scenario where he steps aside is important as well.
Mike, will he listen to those Democrats that you mentioned?
Well, I thought one of the things that was so interesting is think about how President Biden first entered the national political scene. It was as a Senate candidate, 29 years old, in Delaware in 1972. He was elected senator that year against a longtime incumbent by just a few thousand votes, a very close race, even though Richard Nixon, the Republican sitting president, won Delaware overwhelmingly. He didn't get into the weeds the way I just did with you, but that's what he was referring to. He thinks Democrats who are worried about him being a drag on the ticket only need to look at what he did in 1972. What we know, politics is a much different situation right now. The top of the ticket and the down ballot are much more linked. We're almost parliamentary in that way now. And so I think if Chuck Schumer, if Nancy Pelosi, if Hakeem Jeffries were to come to him or ask for time with him, that will be important. President Biden has often talked about the fact that he respects the views, not of pundits, not of people like me who haven't run for office themselves. He respects those who have put themselves on the ballot before he'll listen to anybody else. And I think if he can be made, if there's a convincing case that can be made to him that this is unwinnable and that he is going to hurt the party, that's going to carry a lot of weight with him.
You know, NBC News had some explosive reporting that the New York Times had as well, which was that key aides are now talking to President Biden and these are my words, but essentially talking to him about the possibility of stepping aside. What's your understanding of those conversations?
Well, the president has such a very loyal team of advisors, some of whom have been with him for decades, who continue to be at his side now. The circle of those who are really in on the important day-to-day decision-making, in fact, I think has shrunk somewhat. There are those close to him, and our reporting bears this out, as does the Times, who do believe that this race is unwinnable and that he should consider stepping aside. They are doing their due diligence to prepare him for a graceful exit. The question is he aware of those conversations? Is he gracing those conversations? I don't think so at this point, but they are doing what they need to do to continue to be loyal, to continue to serve him well, to prepare for that possibility. And that's where we are at this moment. I really appreciate all your reporting. We're going to take a quick break. Right after this break, Jen Psaki, she joins us here at Top Story. Stay with us.
After the eye roared ashore. There is some late-breaking news.
All right, and
The paper towel will absorb the acid.
that's crazy.
Green tea to calm acne. This is my favorite tip of the day.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Oh, that's genius. You just saved me $40.
I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started.
President Biden still defiant at his news conference that just wrapped moments ago. The president there defending his time in office so far and saying this is not